Christmas cabin. I used to love Christmas. The warmth, the lights, the sense of comfort that came with the holiday season. But last year, something happened that changed it forever. I don't talk about it much. Who would believe me? But I can't keep it inside anymore. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had rented a remote cabin deep in the snowy woods of Vermont. A picturesque winter wonderland, away from the chaos of the city, where we could enjoy a quiet, peaceful Christmas. Or so we thought. The drive up there was longer than expected. Snow fell thick and fast, making the narrow roads slippery and treacherous. We barely passed another car on the way, and by the time we reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. It was beautiful, though, at first glance. The cabin stood alone among towering pines, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. The porch was decorated with old-fashioned garlands and twinkling fairy lights, giving it that perfect Christmas charm. But the silence, that was the first thing that felt off. Not peaceful silence. It was heavy, unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. "I love it," Emily said, nudging me as we unloaded our bags. "This place is perfect." I forced a smile. "Yeah, perfect." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet, like old candy canes left too long in a drawer. A large Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, already decorated with antique ornaments. Glass baubles, tiny tin soldiers, and delicate porcelain angels. Someone had left a note on the fireplace mantel. "Welcome to Holly Cabin. Make yourself at home and enjoy your holiday. But remember, don't open the red box." I laughed and showed it to Emily. "Weird, right? Probably just a joke," she said, rolling her eyes. In the center of the mantel was a small red gift box, tied with a gold ribbon. It looked old, the wrapping paper faded and slightly torn at the corners. Something about it unsettled me, though. The way it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. That night, we sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and exchanging gifts. Snow tapped against the windows and everything felt right. I was finally starting to relax, until I heard it, a soft scraping noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't stop. A steady, deliberate scratching against the cabin walls. I looked at Emily, and she had heard it too. "Probably just a branch," she said, trying to sound casual, but her eyes darted toward the window. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Cold air hit me like a slap, and the snow crunched under my boots. I swept the beam of light around but saw nothing except the dark stretch of trees. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and led right up to the cabin. But there were no prints leading away. I hurried back inside and locked the door, forcing a smile. "Just the wind," I lied. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of bells. Faint, jingling bells, like the kind you hear in old Christmas songs. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from outside, near the porch. I shook Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened, frowning. "Bells? Maybe a reindeer farm nearby or something?" At midnight, I shook my head. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat. A figure stood just beyond the porch light, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. It was tall and thin, dressed in tattered red fabric that looked like an old Santa suit. The white trim stained dark. His face, it wasn't right. The eyes were too large, too dark, and the mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin that made my stomach turn. It was holding something in its hands. A small, red box. The same red box from the mantel. Emily pulled me away from the window, eyes wide with fear. "Lock the doors," she whispered. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom. The only weapon we had, an old fireplace poker. The jingling of the bells grew louder, circling the cabin. Then came the knocking. Soft, rhythmic knocks on the front door. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" I managed to call out, my voice shaking. A long pause. Then, in a voice that sounded far too cheerful, "Let me in. It's Christmas." Emily clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, the knocking had stopped. I slowly opened the bedroom door, clutching the fireplace poker, and peeked into the living room. The red box was back on the mantel, the gold ribbon perfectly tied. Emily wanted to leave right away, but when we checked outside, the snow had piled up so high overnight that the car was completely buried. No signal on our phones. "We just need to wait for the plow," I said, trying to stay calm. Emily nodded, but she kept glancing at the red box. By noon, the atmosphere in the cabin grew suffocating. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. Every little noise made us jump. Then Emily did the one thing I begged her not to do. She opened the red box. Inside, there was a small, withered piece of paper with faded handwriting. She read it aloud. "He comes when you call him. He stays when you let him in. He leaves when you pay the price." The moment she finished reading, the lights flickered, and then the front door slowly creaked open. A gust of icy wind blew inside, and standing there in the doorway was the figure, that twisted Santa. His head tilted unnaturally, his grin wider than before. "You shouldn't have opened it," he whispered, stepping inside. I don't remember much after that. There were screams. Emily's, mine. Things crashing, the fire roaring to life on its own. I ran, dragging Emily with me through the back door into the snow. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, where a passing truck finally picked us up. When we returned with the police, the cabin was empty. No sign of struggle, no footprints except our own, and the red box gone. Emily doesn't talk about that night. We broke up a few months later. She said she kept hearing the bells, even after we left. I hear them too sometimes late at night. Jingle, jingle, jingle. And every Christmas, no matter where I go, I find a small red box waiting for me. I never open it. Never again. The Christmas Guess. I used to love Christmas. The twinkling lights, the cozy fires, the smell of pine and cinnamon filling the house. But last Christmas changed everything. It all started when my family decided to spend the holiday at my grandmother's old house in the woods. It was a towering Victorian relic, all dark wood and creaky floors, perched at the edge of a frozen lake. It had been in our family for generations, and Grandma used to tell us stories about it. How it was once part of a small village that vanished long ago. Why did the village disappear? I remember asking when I was younger. Grandma just smiled and said, "Some places aren't meant to stay." I never understood what she meant. Not until that Christmas Eve. We arrived late, just as the sun dipped below the treetops, painting the sky in deep crimson. The house loomed over us, its dark windows reflecting the last light of day. My parents, my younger brother Jake, and I unpacked quickly, eager to get inside where it was warm. "Feels colder than usual," Dad muttered as he fumbled with the old brass key. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing the musty scent of old wood and dust. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I chalked it up to the winter air. We settled in, lit the fireplace, and started decorating the house with old ornaments Grandma left behind. It should have been comforting, but something felt off. As I hung a strand of lights near the window, I caught a glimpse of movement outside. Just a shadow shifting between the trees. Probably a deer, I told myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up reading by the fire. The house groaned in the wind, and the snow outside fell heavy and thick. I had just started dozing off when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A soft knock at the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere this late? I tiptoed to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing, just swirling snow and darkness. I locked the door tight and went back to the couch, telling myself I imagined it. But as I drifted off again, tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the window. I sat up so fast I nearly fell off the couch. I didn't want to look, but something pulled me to the window anyway. Outside, half hidden in the snow, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a decoration, a Santa figure draped in ragged red clothes. But then, it moved. I I stumbled backward, biting down a scream. His face, it wasn't right. It was cracked, like old porcelain, with deep, dark holes where the eyes should be. And the smile, it stretched too wide, almost splitting its face in half. The figure lifted a gloved hand and waved. I scrambled upstairs to my parents' room and banged on the door. "Dad, there's someone outside." Dad groaned and got up, stumbling down the stairs half asleep. He opened the door, but nothing was there, just our footprints leading to the car and back. "I swear I saw something," I insisted. Dad sighed. "It's late. Get some sleep." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't listen. So I went to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it. Tap, tap, tap. Christmas morning came, and the house felt different, heavier. I went downstairs, hoping the light of day would chase away the uneasy feeling. But when I got to the living room, I stopped cold. The presents under the tree, they were all opened. Shredded paper littered the floor, ribbons torn apart. Jake stood next to the mess, his face pale. "I didn't do it," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Mom tried to calm him down, but I noticed something she didn't. There were footprints in the torn wrapping paper. Big ones. I bent down and touched the floor where the prints led, right to the front door. It was unlocked. "Dad, did you forget to lock the door last night?" I asked. He frowned. "No, I locked it after you woke me up." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I knew it wasn't the wind that had been inside our house. That afternoon, the power went out. Mom lit candles and tried to keep everyone calm, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every noise made my skin crawl. Then Jake screamed. We ran to the kitchen and found him standing at the back door, his face twisted in terror. "He was here," he sobbed. He was looking at me through the window. Mom pulled him into a hug, whispering reassurances, but when I looked out, I saw it. Footprints, leading from the woods right to our door, but none leading away. Dad swore under his breath and grabbed the old rifle from above the fireplace. "Stay inside," he ordered before stepping out into the snow. We waited, huddled in silence, listening for anything outside. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, Dad came back inside, his face pale. "Nothing out there," he said, but I could tell he was lying. His hands were shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle of the wind made my heart race. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, soft, almost playful. Tap, 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 on my bedroom window. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was. That same figure, its porcelain face cracked, black eyes staring right at me. Its hand pressed against the glass, leaving a smudged red stain. Blood. I screamed, and it vanished. Dad burst into my room, but again, there was nothing outside but falling snow. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," Mom said, holding Jake tight. "This place isn't safe." But morning never came. The tapping didn't stop. It moved from window to window, door to door, circling the house. Scratching, knocking, whispering. By midnight, we were trapped in the living room, huddled together by the dying fire. And then, the front door slowly creaked open. We all stared in frozen horror as footprints formed in the snow, coming inside. The figure stepped into the doorway, tilting its head unnaturally. It lifted a hand and waved. The last thing I remember was the smile stretching wider, impossibly wide. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. The search party found us all unconscious in the house. They said it was carbon monoxide poisoning, a faulty heater, but I know the truth. And every Christmas since, I hear the tapping, tap, tap, tap. The Christmas visitor. I used to love Christmas. The lights, the music, the warmth of it all. It was my favorite time of year until last Christmas. We decided to spend the holidays at my uncle's cabin, deep in the mountains. It was the kind of place you see in those cozy Christmas movies. A big stone fireplace, old wooden beams, and snow piled up against the windows. It was supposed to be perfect, but it wasn't. Started small. The first night, after my parents and my little brother Jake had gone to bed, I stayed up reading by the fire. The logs crackled and hissed, the warmth lulling me into a daze. Then I heard it, a soft tap. I looked up. Came from the window, just a single, deliberate knock. I froze, my breath hitching. It was almost midnight, and we were miles away from the nearest town. Who would be out here? I told myself it was the wind. That's what you do in situations like this, right? Rationalize. But as I crept toward the window, I saw them. Footprints, leading from the edge of the dark forest all the way to the house. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my dad about the footprints. He chuckled, ruffling my hair like I was still a kid. Probably a deer, he said, but the prints were human. Later that day, while helping Mom decorate the tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jake was playing outside, running through the snow, when I heard him scream. We rushed outside to find him standing at the edge of the woods, his face pale as the snow beneath him. I saw him, he stammered, eyes wide. Who? I asked. Jake swallowed hard. Santa. My dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. Santa, huh? He tousled Jake's hair again. Maybe he's checking up on you, buddy. But Jake shook his head furiously. No, it wasn't Santa. It was wrong. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say another word. That night, I heard him crying in his room. Christmas Eve. The storm rolled in heavy and thick, blanketing everything in white. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old cabin windows. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and Jake sat beside the fireplace, staring into the flames. I sat next to him and whispered, "What did you see?" He didn't answer right away. Then, in a tiny voice, he said he was wearing red, but his face was cracked. My stomach twisted. Cracked? Jake nodded. Like a doll. A scary doll. He was smiling too much. A gust of wind banged against the cabin, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I tried to shake it off, but the dread sat heavy in my chest. Then the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering firelight. Dad cursed under his breath and grabbed a flashlight, muttering about old wiring. And that's when we heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, like fingers on glass. Mom gasped. What was that? I swallowed hard. It's coming from the front door. Jake whimpered and buried his face in my side. Dad squared his shoulders and marched over, peering through the peephole. He stepped back immediately, his face pale. There's someone out there. Mom grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it tight. What do they want? Dad didn't answer. He just whispered, "Stay here," and slowly unlocked the door. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but before I could, the door creaked open, revealing the snow-covered porch. Empty. Nothing but swirling snow and darkness beyond. Dad shut the door quickly, locking it tight. Must have been a branch, he muttered, but his hands were trembling. I didn't believe him. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the wind outside, when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I sat up slowly, barely breathing. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, persistent, insistent. I forced myself to pull back the fabric, and what I saw will haunt me forever. A figure stood in the snow just beyond the window, dressed in a tattered Santa suit. Its face was a cracked porcelain mask, painted with a grin too wide, eyes black and empty. It raised a gloved hand and waved at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over my lamp. Mom and Dad came rushing in. I screamed, pointing at the window, but when they looked, there was nothing there, only the wind and swirling snow. But I knew what I saw, and the footprints beneath my window proved it. Christmas morning was tense. No one spoke about the night before, but we all felt it, that heavy, choking fear in the air. Dad said we should pack up and leave early, but when he tried the car, it wouldn't start. We'll call for help, Mom said, but the phone lines were dead. That's when we heard the footsteps, crunching in the snow, slow, heavy, coming closer. We stood frozen, staring at the door. Knock, knock, knock. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. Dad motioned for us to stay back and grabbed the fireplace poker. He inched toward the door and whispered, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, ho, ho, ho. It was deep, guttural, wrong. The door handle rattled, and Mom screamed. Dad slammed his weight against the door, locking it tight. The footsteps moved away, circling the cabin, tapping at the windows one by one. We didn't move, barely breathing as it circled and circled, until finally, it stopped. When morning came, the car started without issue. We piled in without even packing our things and sped down the icy road. As we left, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and I saw him, standing in the snow, watching us. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, cracked porcelain face grinning wide. That was the last Christmas we spent in the mountains. And to this day, every Christmas Eve, I hear the tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. The silent night. I've always loved Christmas. The lights, the snow, the sense of warmth in the air. It's supposed to be a time of joy. But last Christmas, something happened that I can't explain. Something that still keeps me awake at night, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. It all started when my family decided to rent a secluded cabin deep in the woods. My parents wanted to escape the noise of the city, and my little sister Emma was excited about the idea of a real Christmas, complete with a fireplace and snow-covered trees. I wasn't thrilled about being cut off from civilization, but I figured a quiet holiday wouldn't be the worst thing. We arrived at the cabin on Christmas Eve. It was an old, creaky thing, but it had a rustic charm, thick wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and the smell of pine lingering in the air. Snow had already begun to fall, blanketing everything in white. Felt peaceful. At first, after we settled in, we decorated the tree, strung up lights, and sipped hot chocolate by the fire. The cabin had no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell signal. Mom said it would help us connect with each other, but all it did was make me feel cut off. Then came the first sign that something was wrong. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, Emma pointed out something strange outside the window. "Look," she whispered, pressing her nose against the glass. I followed her gaze and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Footprints, leading from the dense forest straight to the cabin. My dad laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal or another cabin nearby. But the tracks were too big, too precise, and they didn't lead away, only toward us. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise, a slow, deliberate creaking sound, like someone walking through the house. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved from the living room, past the kitchen, and stopped outside my door. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then, soft knocking. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, but eventually, it stopped. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Christmas morning should have been a relief, but it wasn't. When we woke up, the front door was wide open. Snow had blown in, covering the floor and the footprints. They were inside the house now. Dad insisted it was just the wind, but I saw the way his hands shook as he locked the door. Emma, being only 7, didn't seem to notice the tension. She was too excited about her presence. But I felt it, the oppressive weight in the air. Something was watching us. That afternoon, while Mom and Dad were outside gathering firewood, Emma and I were inside playing with her new toys when she said something that made my blood run cold. He said I was on the naughty list. I turned to her slowly. "What?" Emma frowned. "The man outside. He was looking through the window last night." My stomach dropped. "Emma, what did he look like?" She hesitated. "Like Santa, but..." "Wrong." My hands were ice cold. "Wrong how?" She shrugged and went back to playing, humming Jingle Bells like nothing was wrong. But I felt it then, the undeniable sensation of being watched. By evening, the storm had gotten worse. Snow piled high against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. We tried to enjoy dinner, but everyone was on edge. Then the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the silence that followed was deafening. Dad muttered a curse and went to check the breaker while Mom lit candles. And then, we heard it, a soft scraping at the front door. Long, deliberate strokes like claws against wood. Emma gasped and clung to me, eyes wide with fear. Dad returned, holding a flashlight, and slowly approached the door. "Probably a branch," he said, voice wavering. He reached for the doorknob. I wanted to scream at him not to open it, but before I could, the door burst open, and something stepped inside. I only caught a glimpse, but it was enough to haunt me forever. A figure, tall and thin, dressed in a tattered red suit covered in grime. Its face was obscured by a cracked porcelain Santa mask, the painted smile too wide, too unnatural. Long fingers curled over the doorframe, tipped with blackened nails. It whispered something in a voice like dry leaves scraping against each other. "Naughty!" Mom screamed, yanking Emma away as Dad slammed the door shut. We pushed furniture against it, but the thing didn't try to break in. Instead, it laughed. A low, rattling sound that echoed through the cabin. Then silence. We didn't sleep that night. Dad sat by the door with a fire poker, and Mom held Emma tight. I stayed by the window, staring out into the storm, expecting to see that figure standing there. But it never appeared. The next morning, the snow had stopped, and the sun rose over a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. We packed our things in a hurry and left the cabin, not daring to look back. When we got home, I thought it was over. But last night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock at my window. I pulled back the curtain, heart hammering. There, pressed against the glass, was a small, cracked porcelain Santa mask, and a whisper, carried by the wind. "Naughty, I don't know what it wants, but I know one thing, Christmas will never be the same again."